Last week, we looked at how God conquered the scourge of sin through Christ, through his sinless death, burial, and resurrection. And we spoke briefly about baptism and the specific baptism that saves. And I just want to say further to that Paul wrote to the Christians in Ephesus and encouraged them. And in chapter 4, verse 4 and 5, he says, "There's one body and one spirit. Likewise, you were called to the one hope of your calling. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism." Strangely enough, that word baptism is actually baptisma. And when I looked up the Greek side of it, it just says baptism. But it's a derivative from a Greek word, baptizo. And that word actually means to make whelmed, that is, fully wet. And it's only used in the New Testament of ceremonial ablution, especially of the ordinance of Christian baptism. Now, I've heard of 7 different types of baptism. You've got sprinkling, pouring, immersion of adults and babies. And then there's also a baptism where they use olive oil. I think it's the Greek Orthodox Church that uses it. I'm not sure how they administer that. But even with these different baptisms, in the religious sector, there's different meanings or reasons why they perform baptism. But here in Ephesians, Paul makes it clear that there's only one baptism that saves. So what happens once we've accepted Christ and been baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection, as we find in Romans chapter 6? Paul writes, he says, don't you know that all of us who were baptized into union with the Messiah Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, through baptism, we are buried with him into his death, so that just as the Messiah was raised from the dead by the Father's glory, we too may live an entirely new life. For if we have become united with him in a death like this, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. We often think that once we're baptized or somebody's been baptized, that's the end of it. Suddenly the new Christian knows everything, is aware of everything, knows what they need to do and what they have to obey. But you see, there's a growth period which actually never ends until we stand before God in the judgment of our lives. We've all probably read the passage Paul wrote in Ephesians 6. Kristen read some of it this morning, about putting on the whole armor of God. Now, before we read what Paul wrote there's a couple of things we need to remember about Paul. First of all, he was a Roman citizen, which was kind of unique for the apostles. He was a Pharisee. He was a stickler for the law. He knew the scriptures from the Old Testament in detail. So when he wrote, he did not write something that was just brand new and pulled out of the sky. A lot of time he quoted scriptures on most occasion. And the whole armor of God was first proclaimed in the Old Testament in several places. We kind of think, well, Paul came up with that. Didn't. You see, the armor described in Ephesians is based on most armies' battle gear of the time. Now, because Paul is writing in Roman time, we kind of think that the armor of God looks like Roman armor. But it actually doesn't. It's a parallel. We've got the helmet, we've got the breastplates, we've got the shields, we've got the sword. And these were common items in a soldier's personal defense equipment. But often it was the skill of the soldier that determined how effective the armor and the weapons were. You see, no one was invincible. The stories of Achilles, and I know it's a mythical story, but it kind of shows that everybody has a weak point. no matter how strong we might think they are. If you want to go to the comic book characters, you've got Superman who's got kryptonite. I don't know about Spider-Man. I think and Doom might do him, but we don't know. But when it comes to God's word and being a Christian, no one is 100% safe from sin. But why go through all this detail when we don't use that type of armor anymore? In fact, I don't even know what body armor the armies use these days. I think they've got bulletproof vests maybe, but that's about it. But you see, the war that has been raging since Adam and Eve, when they ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, it's not a physical war. It never was. And yet we kind of think of it as a physical war against sin and against Satan. But it's one that we don't give enough credit to as to how serious and destructive it is. We're in a spiritual war that cannot be repelled by physical defenses, even though we try. And just like armies and weaponry that have developed over the centuries, so the spiritual war changes in ways we never see coming. In Ephesians 6 and 10, this is what Kristen wrote. Finally, be strong in the Lord, relying on his mighty strength. How often don't we want to rely on our own strength? In verse 11, he says, put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand firm against the devil's strategies. You're not standing against someone that's got a sword or an R1, R4, Armalite, whatever you want to call it these days. You're standing against, as he says in verse 12, it's not against human opponents. It's against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers in the darkness around us, and evil spiritual forces in the heavenly realm. In short, Satan and his cohorts. Now, sometimes we think of Satan's cohorts as demons and devils, but you know, Satan can use anybody as his cohort, because if you're not for God, you're against him. Which means that if you're not for God, you're for Satan. So let's have a look at Ephesians 6, verse 13, where Paul carries on and he says, for this reason take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to take a stand whenever evil comes. And when you have done everything you could, you will be able to stand firm. Stand firm, therefore, having fastened the belt of truth around your waist and having put on the breastplate of righteousness and being firm-footed in the gospel of peace. In addition to having clothed yourself with these things, having taken up the shield of faith with which you will be able to put out all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Also take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Now, having heard all of that, I guarantee you're not going to remember every single thing I've just said now. So let's look at it in detail. Let's first look at where some of the armor of God actually comes from. In Ephesians 6:13, we encourage Paul to take up that armor. And he says, you may be able to stand whenever evil comes. And when you've done everything you could, you will be able to stand firm. For those who have performed military service, you will know that being issued with a uniform and a weapon is only the beginning. You were taught very quickly to look after your own personal equipment and how to use it, how your uniform was to be worn, and how your webbing and kit had to be carried and adjusted to be the most effective. After that, you were prepared physically for the challenges when moving across the battle area. So there was around 6 months of intensive training before you could be considered for operational work. After that training, you were clothed with a pride that came from knowing you were now a soldier, not a boy anymore, but a man. Your individuality had been removed, and you were now part of an exclusive team. In Isaiah 11 verse 5, we see here, Isaiah writes, "Righteousness will be the sash around his loins, and faithfulness the belt around his waist." And then in chapter 59 and 17, he put on righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in fury like a cloak. Once you've gone through the training period in the military, you now know how to use your rifle. You now know how to wear your camouflage. You know how to look after your boots so that when you are hiking, it doesn't chew up your feet so that you can't walk. But you see, even in the Old Testament, it was prophesied, or it was used, that there were things that people put on as serving God. Because Ephesians 6 and verse 14, we read again, "Stand firm, therefore, having fastened the belt of truth around your waist, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness." Now, if I asked you, what is truth and what is righteousness? We probably all have a concept of it. But I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary just to get some definitions. And truth is the body of real things, events, and facts. Actuality. It's not my reality. It's not my perception. It's what is actual. That's truth. And righteousness, acting in accord with divine or moral law, free from guilt or sin. Now, there are further definitions to these words, but I think you get the idea of what we're looking at. It's things that come from God, that it's not our perception, it's not what we think, but it's what God specifies. We're encouraged to be honest, to act as God intends for us by obeying the facts that God has set out for us. You see, it's impossible to be righteous if we don't follow the truth. Now, I tried to have a look at the actual armor that the Romans used in those days. Everyone's got their own idea of that again. But basically, it was a breastplate. There would have been a metal pad on the upper leg, metal thing. Sometimes it was just one leg. If you were affluent enough, you could have two of them. But whether they had the leather skirts as we saw, I don't know. And whether you had to put that on before you put the breastplate on, I don't know. I couldn't find that. But I do know one thing. We can't be righteous if we don't follow the truth. In John 8 and verse 31, from verse 31, "So Jesus told those Jews who had believed in him, 'If you continue in my word, you are really my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.' They replied to him, 'We're Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves to anybody. So how can you say you will be set free?' Jesus answered them, 'Truly, I tell all of you with certainty that everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the household forever, but the son does remain forever. So the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed.'" Those last two verses, I want you to look at them again, because so often we look at it as, well, if you stay in the church, you're free, but if you leave the church, you're not free. That's not what Christ is saying. The slave does not remain in the household forever, but the son does remain forever. Think of that in terms of eternity. It takes on a whole new meaning. So the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Knowing the truth and being righteous is not a permanent given. And we must continue to stand firm in what we believe and practice it. In Isaiah 52 and verse 7, Isaiah writes, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the one who brings news of peace, who announces good things, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." In Ephesians 6:15, Paul writes, "And being firm-footed in the gospel of peace." Many of a soldier has been killed because of indecision or losing their footing. So how do we stand firm-footed in the gospel? By studying God's word. Now I know, as soon as we hear the word study, we want to switch our brains off. I finished school, I went to Sunday school, the preacher told me, and yet even the most famous scholars are still studying and learning. There's a man by the name of Alexander Pope. Some of you might have heard of him. He wrote a poem called An Essay on Criticism. It was composed in 1709. Part of that poem said, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." Sometimes we think, well, we've read the first three verses of the Bible, so we know the Bible. That's exactly what he's talking about. We think we know, but because we don't continue studying, we actually don't see how deep God's word is. If I can take, for example, the accounting world, and I'm not part of that, so I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but you would have a bookkeeper, then you would maybe get a chartered accountant, and after that you get an actuary. And each level takes further study. You don't just become a bookkeeper because you open a book and write down some figures. You've got to know what you're writing down. And when you're a chartered accountant, you've got to know the rules behind it and the laws behind it. And when you become an actuary, well, apparently you do calculations there that would confuddle my little brain. But you see, in 2 Timothy 2:15, very often we want to study the Bible to impress other people. But look at what Paul says to Timothy. Do your best to present yourself to God. Listen again. Do your best to present yourself to God. Not your spouse, not the preacher, not the elders, not your friends, to God. As an approved worker who has nothing to be ashamed of, handling the word of truth with precision. How often don't we discuss the Bible and say, well, I've got this idea that the Bible says. We need to go to the Bible and say, what does it say? And sometimes we think our knowledge and obedience is good enough protection against sin. And having faith, like James talks about, it's not actually this faith that Paul's writing about in Ephesians. James 2 and verse 6, James writes, "For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without actions is also dead." And yes, we must have faith that God is almighty and is in control of our submitted lives. So, what is the shield of faith? I want to go back to Genesis 15:1. God is speaking to Abraham. Sometime later, a message came from the Lord to Abraham in a vision. Don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. In Deuteronomy 33 and verse 29, how blessed are you, Israel? Who can be like you? A people delivered by the Lord, your shield of help, and your finely crafted sword. May your enemies cower before you. You will tread down their high places. Paul says in Ephesians, in addition to having clothed yourself with these things, having taken up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to put out all the flaming arrows of the evil one. You see, it's not our faith that defeats Satan. It is God, our Father. That was an eye-opener for me, because I always was under the impression as I had to stand against Satan's temptations. But it is God who does that, provided I remain loyal to him. He stands in the breach. He's our shield against Satan. In Isaiah 59:17, we read that earlier on. He put on righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. And then in Deuteronomy, we read about the Lord is your shield. In Isaiah 49 and verse 2, we read, he made my mouth like a sharp sword. He hid me in the shadow of his hands. He made me like a polished arrow and hid me away in his quivers. Ephesians 6 and 17, Paul then writes, also take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. The helmet of salvation. You know, armies were and are often identified by their headgear or their unit, depending on the badge on their helmet. But I had a look at the salvation. Again, I went to the dictionary. Salvation, by Merriam-Webster again, deliverance from the power and effects of sin. Also, liberation from ignorance and illusion. I was interested to see the second definition that is there, and again there were other definitions as well, but pertaining to what we're talking about, it actually amplifies how many people are disillusioned when it comes to salvation and God's instructions. We sometimes joke and say, when all else fails, read the instructions. I think most of you have heard that. I think most of you have done that. Plug in the air fryer. Nothing's working. Okay, well, let's read the instructions. Unfortunately, when people realize that they have erred with God's instructions, it will be too late. So the helmet of salvation is what we refer to as being clothed with the blood of Christ. It is our identity, our transformation from individual to member of an elite family. We are also told to take up the sword of the Spirit, which is God's word. You see, it's not what we think, it's not what we want, it's not what we expect. It is God's instructions, and it is not negotiable. So many creeds and practices have been formulated by people who refuse to submit to God's word. Well, I don't quite like what the Bible said, so we'll do it our way. You know that even Jesus did not teach what he wanted to? Just because he was the Son of God and he had all power on heaven and earth, he didn't come and just say what he wanted to. In John 12 and verse 47, if anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not condemn him, because I did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has something to judge him. If you look in the King James Version, it says, has one who judges him. That word is not referring to God. It's not referring to Christ. Because in the very next part of that verse, he says, this is what judges you. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. Because I have not spoken on my own authority. Instead, the Father who sent me has himself commanded me what to say and how to speak. And I know that what he commands brings eternal life. What I speak, therefore, I speak just as the Father has told me. If Christ could not deviate from what God told him or commanded of him, how can we expect to stand before God having altered his word? So to fight spiritual lies and distortions, we have the sword of the Spirit, the word of God. You see, it's not easy or instantaneous to put on the whole armor of God. It takes time, training, and practice, and especially encouragement by those who are supposed to be literate in God's word and obedient in God's household. You know, sometimes we think someone is very au fait in the scriptures, but once we start delving into it, are they actually saying what God says or what they think? That is why Paul said to Timothy, you study to be approved of God. Someone else cannot study for you. You see, this morning there are two questions to answer for yourself. The first one is, have you put on the truth and helmet of salvation through being baptized into the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? The second question, are you wearing the armor of God properly and effectively so that those around you will know you are owned by God? If you have not been baptized to have your sins removed, Paul encourages us through 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. Since then, we are working with God. We plead with you not to accept God's grace in vain. For he says, at the right time I heard you, and on a day of salvation I helped you. Listen, now is really the right time. Now is the day of salvation. None of us have a promise even of this afternoon, let alone tomorrow. Or if you have neglected to serve God as he requires, in Hebrews 3, verse 12 to 14, the Hebrew writer says, see to it, my brothers, that no evil, unbelieving heart is found in any of you, as shown by your turning away from the living God. Instead, continue to encourage one another every day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Because we are the Messiah's partners only if we hold on to our original confidence to the end. Again, the question, have you put on Christ in baptism? Are you following God as he intends for you and has commanded you? If you need to become a child of God or need to return your life to God, won't you come forward now as we stand and sing?